President Cyril Ramaphosa has ordered the deployment of nearly 3,000 troops to the Democratic Republic of Congo. The SANDF will provide support in the fight against armed groups until December of this year, we've been told. This deployment, which is part of South Africa's obligation towards the Southern African Development Community mission, will set back the country around 2 billion rand. And where will that 2 billion rand come from? Let's get you some analysis on this story. Joining us this afternoon is Professor Thomas Mandrup. He's a scholar in African politics and defense policy at Stellenbosch University. Prof, it's great to have you with us on the program. Government says this price tag of 2 billion rand will not impact provisions for the Defence Force's regular maintenance and emergency repairs. But the deployment does also come at a time where the SANDF is not in great shape, to say the least, and they are being deployed to one of the most volatile war zones in Africa.
Yeah, good afternoon and good afternoon to the listeners, and thank you for having me. And you're quite right. Of course, it's good news for the Defence Force, and also something that commentator has been calling for, that if South Africa was going to commit troops to the DRC, that there also additional funding was going to be provided for that. Because in other missions, both domestic and foreign missions, we've seen that funding has not followed this political decisions, which meant that the Defence Force had to take money from its ordinary budgets. It's also something that the Portfolio Committee in Parliament has had a lot of focus on recently, where they've been asking both the DoD but also the government questions around how they're going to make sure that the Defence Force would have sufficient means available for when deployments were to take place. The problem for the Defence Force, as you rightly mentioned, is that the state of the Defence Force has, and the number of amount of personnel being deployed in other engagement, both in border patrolling, Sama operations, and Samim in the Mozambique, and also as part of MONUSCO in Congo, means that the availability of forces, of course, is limited, and also that the equipment available is also. There's a big backlog of maintenance, which costs a lot of money, and it takes time. You cannot just give extra money and then suddenly all the equipment will work. Some of it you need to buy spare parts, you need to do maintenance and all that, and whether this is going to solve the situation. It will solve some of it for the Defence Force, but not all in terms of the capabilities needed to do the proper operation in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the major issues with deployments like this is and we see it in war zones and in parts of the world that have experienced major disasters, right, is that you don't send teams from your country to those areas unless you can guarantee safe evacuation, right? That goes for war zones as it goes for disaster areas as well. Can we guarantee that safe evacuation in this instance?
Yeah, that's one of the things, of course. One could say if South Africa is going to do it by itself, and we look at logistical ability of logistical strategic transport, it's very, very limited because the number of C-130s transport aircraft, which is a small, medium-sized transport aircraft, is not enough. And again, the range it can reach North Kivu, where the force is going to be deployed around Goma, in terms of flying distance and all that. But you need someone else. And again, then you have to look at partners. The U.S. has provided some transport for instance, for the forces in Mozambique. So you need partners to be able to do that. And will they come if you have an emergency and these kind of things? Because as it is right now, because of the backlog of strategic lift, and in other parts of capabilities, this is going to be an issue. And we saw it back when the South African troops were caught in a disastrous operation in Central African Republic, what's popularly known as the Battle of Bangui, where South Africa lost 17 soldiers were killed and a lot of wounded, and they fought a superior force for a long time without any air cover, without the ability of extracting. So the risk of really, really there. And especially where now they're deploying into a very complex situation where you have Uganda, Rwanda supporting the M23 on one side. You have on the Congolese government, mercenaries, Burundian forces and others, where we're looking into a scenario where it's not just militia kind of a situation where they're fighting a militia. It's also more conventional forces being deployed from different countries, which of course makes it much more dangerous for the deployed forces there, and where extraction can be a very reasonable option.
Yeah, so evacuation is one issue. Air support and air cover is another issue. I believe at the beginning of February, the UN Peacekeeping Force Intervention Brigade came under fire when M23 rebels fired at an Oryx helicopter from the SA Air Force. A number of people seriously injured in that attack. Do we have the kind of air support, not only from our country, but from the DRC, either or?
No, of course there is some. I mean, we've seen that with there's been aerial bombardments of M23 positions from the Congolese Air Force, which they have a limited capability. They have some planes and all that. But it is a general problem, and it's both in terms of air cover. You need, in this type of operation, you need attack helicopters to provide that kind of air cover. You need Oryx, for instance, the Oryx helicopter which South Africa has to do the in-mission transport, and you also need the C-130s to do, for instance, drops and all stuff like that. And the problem is that South Africa at the moment, and have very limited availability of that. And even if they were to get these airframes operational because they've got additional funding and then will take time. There's also the question of access to personnel. Do we have the pilots available to actually fly these things? And that's another problem for the SANDF because, again, because of the many years of neglect by the politicians of the Defense Force, they have not had the funding available to do all these kind of things. So that's also an issue. Maybe more importantly, different from when the Force Intervention Brigade under South African lead in 2013 defeated the M23. Now we are looking at a force where we have conventional Rwandan and Ugandan elements into this. They got surface-to-air capability, which means that suddenly they can pose a threat to air assets like the South African helicopters, like we saw with the Oryx. And the problem is that because of lack of funding, the South African Defense Force has not had money to buy proper system anti-aircraft kind of protection system for these platforms, for the helicopters, both the Rifalk and the Oryx, which of course make them more vulnerable for ground attack. And so that's also an issue. And again, it takes time. It's not just because Ramaphosa comes with 2 billion rands now that they can go out and then buy tomorrow, and then it's on these with integrated into these systems. It takes time, and that's because again the many years of neglect, and which means you have to operate in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly seems that we are sending our troops into an incredibly volatile situation without all of the infrastructure that is needed. Professor Thomas Mandrup, let me thank you for your time this afternoon, a scholar in African politics and defense policy. He joins us from Stellenbosch University.